College football nerds, we are doing a hypothetical first one of the season. These are a lot of fun and usually generate a lot of discussion. So, y'all, want to remind you, please like, subscribe. Helps us out a whole lot. Also, y'all have been sharing our videos this year on other platforms. 11 Warriors on the Rivals Ohio State site. I know we get into the Notre Dame world as well, mostly for y'all to be mad at us, but that's okay. Y'all gonna have fun with this one, I promise. I've got a challenge for y'all. I want you to pause the video after you hear what I say, but pause the video and do this for me. Write down or comment below what you think the model is going to predict for this game. Give me a score. Go ahead and give me a score. Write that down in a comment. Watch through the model. That's right. We're going to make y'all watch a lot of this time. Watch through to the model where you see what it predicts, and then tell us why you think the model is wrong, or kind of back up what you think the score is going to be with what you put in initially. Got a little tongue tied there. So without further ado, we're going to get into this. These are always fun, Josh. I think there's some interesting discussion here because we both think these are playoff teams. There's too much with A&M looking bad this weekend. Alabama really looking like they're going to beat Florida, which Notre Dame fans, y'all really should be pulling for Alabama the rest of the year, which means we both think Clemson probably wins that rematch. I think Clemson would then leapfrog Notre Dame, which puts Ohio State and Notre Dame at 3-4, which means they wouldn't play each other, which is kind of unfortunate because those are two blue bloods that we like to see go at it and have a lot of fun on the channel here. So we want to do this hypothetical. There's a lot of frustration with the first playoff committee rankings that came out from Ohio State fans who really felt like they should have been ahead of Notre Dame at second, and maybe some that didn't. So, Josh, I want you to talk about or kind of get us started with maybe some things that Ohio State fans don't know about Notre Dame in terms of how they're matched up. And you can use Indiana as an analogy, and maybe in ways they're different, in ways they're similar, but just kind of get us started in this hypothetical for Ohio State fans with a primer on how Notre Dame would match up against them.
Notre Dame, as a team, is an excellent defense, and I think a lot like Indiana, they play sort of stubborn football where you have to go the length of the field. Nothing is easy. They're the sixth-ranked team in the country in yards per carry allowed. And offensively, they do just enough to keep putting points on the board and keep pressure on you. I think the Indiana comparison, Notre Dame is probably a better defense than Indiana. And I only say probably because I do have a lot of respect for Indiana's defense, but I do think Notre Dame is better. This is one model statistic I'll throw out as this percentage of opponent averages allowed. I mean, Notre Dame's allowing 69% of opponent averages in running, and that's pretty crazy. We say usually anything below 70% is elite. 90% of opponent passing averages is really good. At COVID, these numbers are all a little higher than they normally were, but that's still a good pass defense. And so you really get a team that, yeah, they give up a little bit over the air, but they really make you struggle on the ground. And relative to this matchup, I think that's a difficulty for Ohio State because with Justin Fields, yes, there's a passing game, and we'll get into that and the strengths of Ohio State, but it still ideally would be a run-first team. I mean, they want to be able to establish that inside run game. They want to be able to establish the zone and the outside zone, the zone read, and use that to get teams sort of off balance. Looking at it from a different perspective with the Indiana game, how did Ohio State struggle with Indiana? I mean, they struggled where they were single high safety, and Indiana was able to get guys in isolation and throw deep on them. Notre Dame isn't going to have to be single high safety, I think, against almost anybody in the country. Their run defense is good enough that they can keep a safety back, play with limited numbers in the box, and defend the run. But the other thing is, Notre Dame, much like Indiana, I think is able to exploit you if you go in those sorts of sets. And I don't know that their downfield threats are the same as Indiana's. Now, when they've got their receivers healthy, and especially those outside guys that are big and tall and fast, It was really obvious in the North Carolina game that it's a lot for a corner to handle one-on-one. And a couple times in that game, the corner is in good position, but he just gets out physicaled. And the receiver gets the ball, the corner can't make the tackle, and the receiver's gone. That's a problem for anybody, and it'd be a problem for Ohio State and their single high safety defense. So there's a lot with Notre Dame that you can kind of take from that Indiana matchup. And I'll make one last point there, too. There's a different number of games here, right? I mean, why am I talking about Indiana? Because Ohio State's only played 4 games. Notre Dame's played 9. And, you know, we don't have a lot to go by with Ohio State, but at the end of the day, all we really know is Indiana, the struggles that they had in that game, and then 3 games against teams that are really not very good. Notre Dame has played a lot of football. They're a really sound team. They're sound offensively, and they're really good defensively.
Yeah, and so one of the things for me that is a bit of a ding to Notre Dame in a matchup like this is if you're looking at Indiana, like you said, they had an explosive offense, which, you know, some of those explosive plays, you take a couple of those off the board, and that game is way different. But they were able to put up points. I don't think Ian Book's throwing for 5 touchdowns against Ohio State. But the flip side of that is Indiana absolutely cannot run the ball. They're like 120 something in the country in yards per carry or yards per attempt. Notre Dame can run the ball, which I think would present a lot of problems in terms of keeping Ohio State's offense off the field. The problem, the problem with Notre Dame or Indiana was Ohio State was getting theirs. But when Indiana scored, it was quick hitter stuff, and they weren't keeping Ohio State's offense off the field. So I think in some ways not being super explosive is a bit of a boon to your defense. So you're playing a little bit of defense with your offense if you can keep the chains moving, hold on to the ball, and drive the field a little bit and keep Ohio State's offense off the field. So on the flip side, if we're talking about what Ohio State does well and where they would present some matchup problems for Notre Dame, let's look at kind of who they are and maybe showcase some concerns that we have in terms of Notre Dame's inability to really create separation against teams like North Carolina and Boston College and Louisville. Let's get into that.
Ohio State really starts with the offense. There's a lot of discussion about defense and their struggles. Now, we've talked about it a lot this year. College football in general is now set to where elite offenses kind of rule the day. And the goal is to have an elite offense and then the best defense is possible to complement them. If you have an elite offense, it's almost impossible to keep them under 35, and they generally are going to score in the 40s. Ohio State is 5th in the country in yard per attempt. They are 9th in the country in yards per play. Again, only 4 games. Competition is maybe sketchy, but it is what it is. You know, how did Ohio State beat Indiana? They beat them by having a really dynamic offense that continued to score points and stay ahead. I think the interesting thing with Notre Dame this season is, you know, they're winning games, but they kind of keep struggling to get to the fourth quarter and put it away. You know, obviously the Louisville game's 12-7. That's been harped on. Daniel likes to harp on it. I think maybe it gets harped on too much. But even like the North Carolina game, you know, that's a 2-score game. It got put away late. North Carolina had an opportunity to really make it a game and to take control of it, and instead they stall. Notre Dame scores, they put it away. Boston College was very similar. It was only a 2-score game, put away late. And you look through, you know, throughout their schedule, there are one game, 2 games, 3 games, 4 games, 5 games now out of 9. 5 games out of 9, there were 2 scores or less. 2 scores is a lot, but still, a lot of them were contested, and a lot of those 2-score games got put away late. There's 2 ways to look at that. I think the first way is to look at Notre Dame as a team that finds a way to win, right? And I think great defenses tend to do that sometimes, where they keep you in the game, and you get to the end of it, and they make a key stop, you score, you win the game. That was Alabama's formula a lot in the 2009 to roughly 2014 period, where they would kind of, you know, grind it out late. And then I think that there was a Tennessee game with Alabama where Derrick Henry scored late in their, I think 2015 season, in that title season, where they were trailing Tennessee till late, got a stop, Henry scored, and that was it. And it was really the defense that allowed them to do that because they kind of kept the game tight until the offense could take over. I think the other way to look at it, though, is we're not in 2009 to 2015 anymore. And when you're in these games and you're putting it away late, yes, it's a positive that you're able to stay in it defensively, but I think it's also a concern because you're going to get into a game where the other team's going to score a lot of points at some stage. And Notre Dame did get into one of those with Clemson, but I think the Clemson example almost like works against you because Clemson had the exact problem I'm talking about could happen to Notre Dame. Clemson was trying to sort of stay in it and put it away late. They never did manage to put away Notre Dame, and Notre Dame scored a couple opportune points and won the game instead. It's again, Indiana, Penn State is another example. If you're not putting teams away, you're in trouble. And with Notre Dame, as good as the defense is, I think Ohio State's going to get theirs. And I think Notre Dame's corners really impressed me in the North Carolina game, but I still think Ohio State's receivers are really good, and they're going to find ways to score points. You put all that together, and Notre Dame's defense is really good, but I think the efficient, consistent offense maybe isn't going to be quite enough to ever put it away or gain control, and you're constantly going to be in a shootout with a team in Ohio State and in a shootout with an offense that probably isn't really comfortable being in that position.
One of the things I'll note about Notre Dame, though, again, going back to them versus Ohio State in terms of matchups, Ohio State hasn't faced a lot of good running quarterbacks. We saw Trevor Lawrence give them trouble last year. And it's not entirely fair because Trevor Lawrence running the ball is a function of that offense. Like, that's part of what they do. That's their DNA. Ian Book isn't really a runner so much as that he's got great feet and can keep a play alive. But that could pose some problems. You talk about Notre Dame, and we have harped on this for years with them, and it's been true every time we've done it. And I do think they're a better team this year than they have been in the past where this has been a problem. But 7-point lead with 2 minutes left in the game against North Carolina, you tack 1-1 late. That's generally a concern, not a, hey, we got a nice 2-touchdown win over a previous top 10 team, because they're not a top 10 team. To be an elite, you got to blow people out. But one thing I see in Notre Dame is that they might not blow teams out, but they're also the type of team that's just, they're playing good team, they're playing bad team. The score's going to be tight either way, which means, no, they might not blow out North Carolina, but they also are going to be in the game in the fourth quarter against Ohio State. So that's an interesting kind of consideration with the way they play. Even against the first playoff matchup against Clemson, a couple of those bombs don't go Clemson's way, and that maybe is a fourth quarter game. So it's worth thinking about. So with all of that, and we can talk about matchups and hypotheticals all day long, but people are here for the model. And the model has been up and down this year. That makes sense because of COVID. Things are isolated. Things are weird. But let's just talk about it because if nothing else, it gives us a baseline for how teams are performing even within their own conference against the competition that they have to face. So get us into the model. Remember, write down what you think the model is going to say before you see this segment, and then comment after what you think about the results. So get us into it, Josh.
Our model, for those that aren't acquainted, and I think we might get some new faces here, it's a per play model that looks at how your team did against the opponents you played. It looks at how those opponents did against other teams they played, and it gets an idea of your performance relative to expectations for your opponents, right? Totally relational model, totally opponent adjusted. Based on that, we look at your matchup with this opponent in this game and get an idea of your production. And then based off the production, we look at your past games and we sort of plug it in. And it's a machine learning concept. The model looks at your scoring and says, what do you need to score points? And what does it look like when you have this kind of production? And generates a point total customized to your individual team in the sort of output you get. Some teams score points more easily than others. Some teams need a lot of yardage. Some teams score kind of no matter how many yards they have. In this case, you kind of have the example of diametrically opposed ways that you reach a result. I mean, Ohio State is a high offensive output team with really mediocre defensive statistics. Right now, they're 95% of opponent rushing averages allowed, 116% of opponent passing averages. What does that mean? If you average 5 yards per carry and a team allows you to get 4, you've allowed 80% of their averages. So basically, Ohio State allows you to get your average day rushing and about your average day plus 15% passing. They are worse than average for Big Ten teams. Notre Dame defensively, as already said, was 69% and 91. So they're way below your average running and about 90% passing. I should note passing numbers. We usually don't see that number go from anywhere, can really be from 80% to 120%, but it's stuck within that range. The rush numbers can go wildly one way or another. Teams generally get what they get passing for the most part, and teams up and down in a given game is usually more about the quarterbacks being hot and cold than it is a defense. You're just adjusting it relative about 20% of their average production. In this matchup, Ohio State's offensive statistics are pretty much completely negated by Notre Dame's defensive statistics. Ohio State, 10 yard per attempt, 5 yard per carry team, as I said, really high statistically, particularly passing, 5th in the country. Notre Dame, 5 yards per carry, 5.2, and 8.3 yards per attempt. That's a good run game and a pretty average passing game on paper. The problem is Notre Dame is so much better defensively, it perfectly balances out. Teams throw well on Ohio State. So you end up with about 9.8 yards per attempt projected for Ohio State, about 9.6 yards per attempt for Notre Dame. About the same passing. Maybe a little bit of an edge for Ohio State. And Ohio State's expected to run for only about 3.6 yards per carry, and that's because Notre Dame's run defense is so good. And Notre Dame rather is expected to run for about 4.9 yards per carry, and that's because Ohio State's run defense is pretty average. The net result there is Notre Dame outgaining Ohio State almost 7 yards per play to about 6.3. The problem with that, though, is Ohio State's more efficient than Notre Dame. Ohio State finds a way to score points. They get defensive scores in games. They have good special teams. The things that generate hidden points in games, right? Better down and distance situations, avoiding negative plays. Explosive plays in particular are way more efficient at generating points from yardage. And because of that, you end up with a tie result. The model projects 39-39. If you want to get real specific, it's Ohio State 39.3 to Notre Dame 38.9. But at that point, you're within the realm of rounding error. This is a dead heat in the model, a 39-all game where Ohio State's offensive prowess is perfectly matched by Notre Dame's defensive prowess, and neither team has a clear edge based off how you've played this season.
It's close. Obviously 39-39 doesn't get closer than that. And this is why we did this episode, this hypothetical, because both of these, and it also solidifies in our mind that both of these are playoff teams, because we don't think that if you put a team that's currently ranked 5th, 7th, 9th, or whatever on the other side of one of these teams in the model, they're going to perform as well. So this kind of shows that this is the end of the drop off. Like, you've got this group in the top 4, and then there's some fall off there. I do think it's interesting that the model is pulling out a little bit that Notre Dame's a balanced team. They run the ball, and Ohio State really hasn't faced a lot from that standpoint this year. So they could kind of get theirs in other ways in aggregate and not just in explosive plays. It's worth noting that this model is, assuming that these conferences are of equal quality, because it has no other way to look at this, given that everybody's on an island this year. So that's something that we have to take with a grain of salt. Like, do we think that the Big Ten competition on average is better than the ACC? Historically we have. This year, maybe not. Josh, you and I have said that maybe ACC is a good bit stronger this year than they have been in the past. But if you think the Big Ten is stronger, then, and it's not just the teams that Ohio State's played, it's how other teams have played against the teams they've played. So it's another level down. Then you could see that maybe there's a jaundiced eye that the model has, and that Ohio State is actually a better team on paper. I think it's hard to model, and we've talked about this all year long. It's hard to model, but there's always some kernel of data that the model can pull out that shows kind of who these teams are. Give me your big takeaways from this.
I think my biggest takeaway probably is that a lot of people may expect Ohio State to be the better team because of name brand, because of the recruiting rankings, because of the preseason expectations. But in the era of COVID, Notre Dame's and what I think is a lot of continuity they have on their team, particularly at key positions, benefits them tremendously. Ohio State had a lot of young guys coming in. And every year we do previews and stuff, and we don't talk a lot about newcomers, and people get on to us about how X player is going to be the next Percy Harvin or what have you. And we always say, look, we're not beat writers, but we just don't like talking about guys until we get to really see them. And we really didn't do that this year with a lack of spring practice and such, because sometimes we'll talk a little bit if we can actually watch a spring scrimmage and see, put eyeballs on a guy a little bit. Ohio State's newcomers on the defensive side of the ball in particular just haven't quite lived up to that billing. Now, a lot of that problem for Ohio State, I think, circles back to something I said earlier. 4 games for Ohio State, 9 games for Notre Dame. If Ohio State was going into game 10, not game 5, this might be a different discussion, because Alabama is a completely different team right now than they were in week 3 and week 4. And I'm not sure where Ohio State would be after 9 or 10 games. The problem is Ohio State is not going to get 9 or 10 games. I mean, when they get to the playoff, they're probably going to be in game 7, game 8. They're not going to have the number of games Notre Dame has right now. So I'm not sure how much you can take from that. I mean, Notre Dame is a team with consistency, with coaching staffs, with players for years and years. I mean, not just necessarily this year, but a lot of consistency with how that program has been run. They don't have a lot of guys constantly going out early, and it shows. And they also have the advantage of having played more ball. You put all that together, and you end up with a team that looks like a more complete team. I think at the end of the day, if you're an Ohio State fan, a lot of your anger, if you end up in a situation where you lose a close game, still has to be directed towards the Big Ten and the way they, ran the situation with COVID. I get why they make precautions and did some of the things they did. There was no reason, though, to delay it. We were very vocal about that on Twitter when they went through the decision-making process. It was always going to be extremely damaging for them not to make a very quick decision. So they had bye weeks like, the SEC, where they're scheduling extra games right now. Games that were delayed are all getting played. And they could have sort of negated a lot of the problems they're going to deal with. Instead, you're end up in a situation where you're going to go in with a lot less experience than everyone else, and you're going to look like a less experienced team, which is a bad thing when you're a team that has a lot of turnover because you got a lot of talent. To me, that's my big takeaway. Ohio State may be more talented. Notre Dame is more experienced and playing better. Notre Dame's defensive statistics and their overall balance out Ohio State's potential, and you end up in a game where the teams are equally matched, though coming at it from very different perspectives.
And this video has maybe felt like a little bit of a Notre Dame slant, but it's really because until you look at the numbers, until you look at the teams, my thinking was like, gosh, if they actually lined up and played, Ohio State would kill them. And that's really not fair. And the more we talk through it and the more we look at the numbers, I don't think that's the case. I think it would be a good game. I will say, in Ohio State's defense, one thing we've seen in the era of COVID is offense is still ahead of the defenses. And so I would be much more concerned for Ohio State in the playoffs if they were if their elite side of the ball was defense and not on offense, having so few games to play. I like the fact that, like, okay, so what? Let's just say Ohio State's defense is not good. You're still going to have to score 45, 47 points to beat them. And I just don't know how many teams out there can do that. And I certainly don't know if Notre Dame can, although they did put up plenty against Clemson. So, all right, y'all, let us know what you think about the hypothetical. Make sure to share us around wherever it helps us out so much. And let us know in the comments what you think about the model on this, what you think about, like, what would be your score prediction if these two teams played tomorrow. We don't do score predictions on hypotheticals, but it's always a worthy discussion. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.